Hey man insults Clint Eastwood on a first-class flight and instantly regrets it when the truth is revealed. Clint Eastwood sat alone at the back of the funeral home, watching as strangers filed past the open casket with solemn nods. At 74, his weathered face remained impassive, revealing none of the complex emotions stirring beneath the surface. He adjusted the collar of his dark shirt, uncomfortable in formal attire after decades of preferring simple, worn clothing. His presence was quiet but commanding, a force that required no words to be felt. The deceased, Richard Calloway, had been a prominent banking executive, known for his sharp suits and sharper tongue. Even in death, his face retained a hint of the disdain he'd worn so comfortably in life. Clint had known him only briefly, yet found himself executor of the man's substantial estate, a responsibility that puzzled him almost as much as the personal letter Richard had left, asking Clint to oversee the distribution of his wealth. "He changed his will 3 months ago," came a voice beside him. Clint turned to find Maria Delgado, Richard's longtime assistant. Dark-haired, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to operating behind the scenes. "After that flight you shared to Los Angeles, he said it was the most expensive lesson he'd ever received." Clint's expression remained neutral. Didn't realize a conversation could be worth that much. "Whatever you said to him that day shook something loose." Maria smoothed her black dress. "He spent his final months reevaluating everything. His house needs clearing. He specified you should stay there until everything's settled." She pressed a sleek key card into Clint's palm. "The penthouse downtown. The past has a way of echoing in empty spaces." Outside, the November wind cut through the streets of Manhattan. Clint slid into his rental car, the key card a strange weight in his pocket. The drive to Richard's penthouse wound through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods, each intersection revealing more opulent buildings. Strange that Richard had requested he stay there, in the home that had been a symbol of everything the man had valued in life. As the elevator ascended to the top floor, Clint reflected on their brief encounter months ago. A chance meeting on a first-class flight, where Richard had made his disdain for Clint's worn jeans and casual demeanor painfully clear. Their conversation had been brief but pointed, Clint responding to arrogance with understated wisdom that apparently had lingered longer than he'd imagined. The penthouse doors opened directly into a vast living space, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a staggering view of Central Park. Clint stood motionless, taking in the pristine furniture, the carefully curated art, the overall sense of a life built on appearances. The key card felt heavier with each passing moment. Finally, he moved through the space, noting the absence of personal touches. No family photos, no mementos, just carefully selected objects that projected wealth and taste. This had been Richard Calloway's fortress, and now Clint Eastwood had been granted temporary ownership of the kingdom. Alexandra Chen carried her coffee through the busy lobby of Calloway Financial, her movement precise despite the early hour. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had earned her position through relentless competence. Her most distinctive feature was her silver-streaked black hair, cut in a sharp bob that framed calculating eyes. She never wore anything but tailored suits in muted colors, her armor in the battleground of high finance. "Heard Calloway's will is being executed by some Hollywood type," called James from the elevator bank, "staying at Richard's penthouse while he settles the estate." Alexandra maintained her steady pace toward her office. "Is that so?" "Yeah. Clint Eastwood, actor and director. Apparently they met on a flight a few months back." James leaned against the wall. "Think he'll stick around long?" "Not my concern," Alexandra replied, but the name triggered something, a memory of Richard, returning from Los Angeles strangely subdued, mentioning an encounter that had left him unsettled. That had been, 3 months ago, before his sudden change in behavior, before everything shifted. Later, as Alexandra reviewed quarterly projections in her corner office, she found herself staring out at the building where Richard's penthouse occupied the top floor. For the first time since his death, lights glowed from the windows. Alexandra gripped her pen tighter. That penthouse held memories she'd spent years carefully compartmentalizing, the late-night strategy sessions, the questionable deals, the way Richard had gradually shifted the company's ethical boundaries. She had been his right hand through it all, maintaining plausible deniability while implementing his vision. And now this outsider was there, sleeping under the same roof where so many decisions had been made. Alexandra returned to her work, unsettled. She had rebuilt her reputation carefully after business school, a methodical rise through the ranks of New York's financial elite. The arrival of Clint Eastwood threatened the narrative she'd constructed so carefully. Some questions were better left unasked. Richard's penthouse was an exhibition of wealth rather than a home. Clint moved through it carefully, opening blinds to flood the space with natural light. Richard had apparently been using the main room as a display for his success. Awards lined the walls, expensive art punctuated every surface. The kitchen remained pristine, its appliances clearly rarely used. Clint explored the vast space, finding a home office with a large mahogany desk. Unlike the rest of the penthouse, this room showed signs of recent intensive use. Files were stacked in neat piles, a legal pad covered in notes, a laptop closed but positioned for immediate use. On the desk sat a leather portfolio, its cover embossed with Richard's initials. Clint hesitated before opening it, his instincts battling with a lifetime of respecting privacy. Curiosity won. Inside, he found Richard's distinctive handwriting, the entries dated over the past 3 months. August 23rd, 2024. The doctor confirmed what I've suspected. 6 months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment, not enough time to fix everything, but perhaps enough to leave something better behind. Clint's hands stilled. Richard had been dying, and he'd told no one, not his colleagues, not his board. From what Clint had gathered at the funeral, he continued reading. September 15th, 2024, started reviewing all our major accounts. Everything needs to be transparent when Alexandra takes over. The offshore accounts are the problem. Our clients deserve better than what we've given them. Clint closed the portfolio abruptly. What offshore accounts? And Alexandra Chen, the name had appeared repeatedly in the legal documents surrounding Richard's estate. His second-in-command, apparently being positioned to take over the company despite the board's reservations. He moved to the window, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline, its towers reflecting the late afternoon sun. The city looked different from this height, more pattern than chaos, more design than accident. A movement in the reflection caught his attention. A woman stood at the entrance to the room, watching him. Even before she spoke, Clint knew who she was. "The doorman told me someone was staying here," she said, her voice controlled but tense. "I didn't expect to find Clint Eastwood going through Richard's papers." Clint turned, facing her directly. "Ms. Chen, you know who I am." "Not a question. Richard's letters mentioned you several times." Alexandra Chen moved further into the room, her eyes taking in the open portfolio on the desk. "You have no right to those." "As executor of his estate, I have every right," Clinty replied, his voice calm but firm. "Though I'm still trying to understand why he chose me for the job." "That makes 2 of us." She crossed her arms. "A brief conversation on a flight hardly qualifies you to dismantle a financial empire." Clint studied her, the perfect posture, the carefully neutral expression that nevertheless couldn't quite hide her unease. Sometimes an outside perspective is exactly what's needed. "You know nothing about our business," she countered. "I know." Richard was having second thoughts about how it was run. Clint gestured toward the portfolio. He was planning changes, big ones. Alexandra's composure slipped briefly, a flash of something, fear, anger, crossing her face before she regained control. Richard was ill. His judgment was compromised. Or maybe it was clearer than it had been in years. Clint held her gaze steadily. He left very specific instructions about the audit. "What audit?" Her voice had sharpened. "The independent review of all company holdings and practices that begins tomorrow morning." Clint watched her reaction carefully. "Didn't the board inform you?" Alexandra's hands clenched at her sides. They failed to mention it. The tension between them stretched, filled with unspoken accusations and defenses. "Why are you really here?" Alexandra finally asked. "What did Richard tell you?" Enough to know he was trying to make amends for something. Clint's voice remained even. "The question is whether you're part of the problem or part of the solution he envisioned." Alexandra's laugh held no humor. Richard Calloway spent 30 years building a financial institution that operates exactly how he designed it. 3 months of guilty conscience doesn't change that legacy. "Legacies can be complicated," Clint replied. "Maybe that's why he wanted an outsider's eyes on this one." He could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, assessing threats, weighing options, planning countermoves. "Whatever you think you know," she said finally, "remember that Richard's world is built on relationships you don't understand and complexities you can't begin to grasp." "Maybe," Clint acknowledged, "or maybe it's simpler than everyone pretends. Right and wrong don't change much based on the number of zeros in your bank account." Alexandra's expression hardened. "I'll see you at the board meeting tomorrow, Mr. Eastwood. I'd suggest you prepare thoroughly." With that, she turned and left, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors. Clint returned to the portfolio, turning to the most recent entry. November 1st, 2024. Alexandra suspects something. "The changes I've initiated at the foundation have raised questions I'm not ready to answer. If something happens to me before the transition is complete, Clint Eastwood will know what to do. Sometimes only an outsider can see the truth of what we've built." The last sentence was underlined 3 times. Clint closed the portfolio, troubled by the implication. Had Richard suspected his time might be cut even shorter than his doctors predicted? The next morning, Clint arrived at Calloway Financial's headquarters, dressed in a simple dark suit, the only concession he'd made to the environment he was entering. The tower rose 60 stories above Manhattan, its glass exterior reflecting clouds and neighboring buildings, like a mirror designed to deflect closer inspection. The security guard did a double take when Clint presented his credentials, then directed him to the executive elevator. "Boardroom's on 58, sir. They're expecting you." The elevator opened directly into a reception area where Maria Delgado waited, a tablet in hand. "You're early," she noted with approval. "The board doesn't convene for another 30 minutes. Thought I might take a look at Richard's office first," Clint replied. Maria nodded. "Follow me." Richard's corner office occupied prime real estate, with 2 walls of windows overlooking the city. Unlike the sterile penthouse, this space contained more personal touches, framed awards mixed with occasional photos of Richard at charity events or breaking ground on new developments. "He spent more time here than at home," Maria explained, "especially these last few months." Clint moved toward the desk, noting the same precise organization he'd seen at the penthouse. He was preparing for something. "Yes," Maria's voice lowered. "After he received his diagnosis, he became fixated on what he called setting things right. He had me pull files from the archives, cases from a decade ago, client histories that seemed random to me." "But not to him," Clint observed. "No." Maria hesitated. "Mr. Eastwood, I've worked for Richard for 15 years. I've never seen him afraid until these last few months, and it wasn't the cancer that scared him." "What then?" "I think he was afraid of leaving things as they were." She glanced toward the door. "Alexandra has been asking questions about what files he accessed, what changes he made to his will. She came to his office the night before he died." Clint turned to face her fully. "Did they argue?" Their voices were raised. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough. Maria's eyes met his. "She told him destroying his legacy wouldn't bring redemption. He told her some legacies deserve to burn." The boardroom doors were already open when Clint arrived, precisely on time. 8 men and 3 women sat around a massive table, all wearing expressions of barely concealed impatience or curiosity. Alexandra Chen sat at the far end, her position a clear statement of her authority in Richard's absence. "Mr. Eastwood," greeted William Foster, the board chairman, "we appreciate you joining us today, though many of us remain confused by Richard's unconventional choice of executor." Clint took the seat left empty at the head of the table, Richard's former position. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Present. Richard's instructions were clear, Clint replied, both in his will and in his personal correspondence with me. Yes, well, Foster cleared his throat. While we respect the legal requirements, we hope to expedite this process. Ms. Chen has been groomed to assume leadership for years. The transition should be straightforward. Clint opened the folder he'd brought with him. Before any transition, Richard requested a full independent audit of all company holdings, practices, and accounts. A tense silence fell over the room. Alexandra's expression remained neutral, but her fingers tightened visibly around her pen. "That's highly irregular," said Foster finally. "Our annual audit was just completed last quarter." "This is different," Clint replied. "Richard specifically requested examination of offshore holdings, client trust allocations, and the Artemis Fund." The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Exchanged glances, shifted postures, a barely audible intake of breath from someone down the table. "The Artemis Fund is a private investment vehicle," Alexandra stated flatly, "outside the company's official portfolio." And yet, Richard's notes indicate significant company resources were directed there. Clint met her gaze steadily, along with client funds that may not have been properly disclosed. Foster leaned forward. "Mr. Eastwood, you're making serious implications about a company you know nothing about." "I'm not making implications. I'm following Richard's explicit instructions." Clint pushed a document across the table. "This authorizes the audit team to begin work immediately. Any board member who obstructs the process will be named in the report sent to regulatory authorities." The tension in the room thickened. Alexandra's eyes never left Clint's face, her expression a careful mask. "Richard wasn't himself these last months," she said finally. "His illness affected his judgment." "That's not your call to make," Clint replied, "nor mine. The audit will determine whether his concerns were valid. And if they weren't," she challenged, "then you'll have nothing to worry about when you take control of the company." The meeting concluded shortly after, with the board reluctantly acknowledging the audit would proceed. As the members filed out, Alexandra remained seated, waiting until they were alone. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said quietly. "The damage this could cause extends far beyond our walls." Clint regarded her thoughtfully. "Is that a threat or a warning?" "An observation. Richard built something complex. Pulling one thread could unravel thousands of lives, not just the wealthy ones. If it's built on deception, maybe it needs unraveling." Alexandra stood slowly. "I've worked alongside Richard for 15 years. I've implemented his vision faithfully. Whatever he told you about me—" "He told me you were brilliant," Clint interrupted, "that you understood the system better than anyone. What he couldn't decide was whether you'd use that brilliance to protect what he built or help him transform it." She seemed genuinely surprised by this. Transform it into what? Something he could be proud of at the end. Alexandra gathered her papers, considering him. "You're not what I expected." "I get that a lot." "The audit won't find what you're looking for." Richard was careful. "Then we have nothing to worry about," Clint replied. She paused at the door. "Do you know why I think he chose you? Because you're the antithesis of everything he spent his life pursuing. The man in the worn clothes who commanded more respect in silence than Richard could with all his power. He was trying to understand what he'd missed." After she left, Clint remained at the table, contemplating her words. On the surface, Richard Calloway and Clint Eastwood couldn't have been more different. Yet something in their brief encounter had resonated deeply enough to alter Richard's final choices. The soft chime of his phone interrupted his thoughts, a text from an unknown number. Richard's real office was at the Foundation, not Calloway. Financial 212 Riverside Drive. The keycard works there too, come alone. The Calloway Foundation occupied a renovated brownstone on the Upper West Side, far from the gleaming corporate headquarters downtown. Its mission statement, elegantly etched on a plaque by the entrance, proclaimed dedication to sustainable development and economic opportunity for underserved communities. Clint found the discreet card reader by the side entrance, and gained access to a space that immediately felt more authentic than either the penthouse or the corporate office. Here, photos showed Richard in remote villages, at community center, openings standing alongside people who weren't wearing power suits or fake smiles. The office at the back of the building was modest by comparison to his corporate suite, a simple desk. Comfortable chairs, bookshelves filled with works on economic development and environmental sustainability. "He spent 3 days a week here these past few months," came Maria's voice from the doorway. "The board doesn't know. They think he was at medical appointments." Clint turned to find her watching him, worry evident in her expression. "Why show me this?" he asked. "Because this is the real legacy he wanted to protect." She moved into the room, activating a computer on the desk. Richard made his fortune through methods he came to regret. The foundation was his attempt at balance. Recently, he decided balance wasn't enough. The computer screen displayed a series of documents, transfer authorizations, funding allocations, project proposals. He was moving money from the Artemis fund into the foundation, Clint observed, scanning the figures. Substantial amounts. The Artemis Fund was Richard's creation, a private investment, vehicle for the firm's wealthiest clients. The returns were exceptional, which kept questions to a minimum. Maria's voice was tight. What clients didn't know was that a significant portion of those returns came from activities that skirted legal and ethical boundaries. What kind of activities? Environmental exploitation in countries with minimal regulation, displacement of indigenous communities for resource extraction, the usual corporate predation, just hidden behind enough shell companies to maintain deniability. Clint studied the documents. And now he was draining the fund to support projects countering that damage. Yes, but the fund operates on leverage. If too many assets are removed too quickly, Maria left the implication hanging. The whole structure collapses, Clint finished, and with it, the firm's reputation. And the wealth of some very powerful people. Maria met his gaze, including everyone on that board. Alexandra knows this. Alexandra helped design the system. She executed Richard's vision perfectly for years. But when he wanted to dismantle it, Maria's voice trailed off. The night before he died, they had their final confrontation. The next morning he was gone. Heart failure, supposedly. The implication hung in the air between them. "That's a serious accusation," Clint said quietly. "It's not an accusation, it's a fear." Maria glanced toward the door. Richard changed in these final months. He wanted redemption, but he also wanted to protect the Foundation's work. That's why he chose you. Someone outside the system. Someone who already made him question his values. Clint thought back to their brief interaction on that flight. He hadn't set out to challenge Richard Calloway's worldview. He'd simply refused to accept the man's arrogance as normal or acceptable, a small act of integrity that had apparently resonated deeply. "What would Richard want me to do with this information?" he asked finally. Maria's answer was immediate. Complete what he started. Balance the scales his way. 3 days later, Clint faced the board again. The preliminary audit results had been circulated that morning, causing a shockwave through Callaway Financial's upper management. The boardroom was tense, faces grim as Clint entered. "This is outrageous," Foster began without preamble. "These allegations would destroy the company if made public." "They're not allegations," Clint replied, calmly. "They're documented facts about how the Artemis Fund operates." Richard recognized the problem and began addressing it before his death. "By embezzling from the fund," Alexandra's voice was controlled, but tight with anger. "By undermining 30 years of work. By redirecting resources to repair damage the fund caused," Clint corrected. "The documentation is clear." "What documentation?" Richard covered his tracks. "Not from me." Maria Delgado entered the room, carrying a laptop. He ensured I kept copies of everything. The surprise on Alexandra's face quickly transformed to calculation. "Maria, always the loyal assistant." "Loyal to Richard's final wishes," Maria replied, "not to the system that corrupted him." For the next hour, Maria presented evidence of both the Artemis Fund's questionable operations and Richard's systematic efforts to redirect its resources toward restitution. "This leaves us with a choice," Clint said when she finished. "Continue the transformation," Richard began, "or fight a public battle. None of you will win." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Foster leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A controlled transition. The Artemis Fund is wound down ethically, with holdings liquidated to support the Foundation's expanded mission. Callaway Financial adopts new governance ensuring transparency, and the right leader takes the company forward." All eyes turned to Alexandra, whose expression remained unreadable. "You think I'm the right leader?" she asked, skepticism evident. "After presenting evidence, I helped create this system." "Richard thought you could be," Clint replied. "He wrote that you understood both the problems and the solutions better than anyone. The question was whether you'd have the courage to implement them." Alexandra's carefully maintained composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw beneath. Perhaps grief, perhaps fear, perhaps simple uncertainty. "He didn't give me the chance," she said finally. "He made these decisions unilaterally, put the company at risk without consultation." "He was dying," Clint said simply, "and trying to ensure the company didn't die with him, at least not the parts worth saving." The room fell silent as Alexandra stood and walked to the window, her back to the group as she considered. When she turned, her decision was evident in her posture. "I can make this transition work," she said. "Not because I've had a moral epiphany, but because I understand the financial and legal realities better than anyone. This company will survive, and maybe it will be better for the changes." It wasn't a passionate commitment to ethics, but it was honest, and perhaps more reliable for being so. Clint nodded. Richard would consider that a start. The meeting continued as Alexandra outlined the practical steps required. Throughout, Clint watched her, noting the competence, the strategic thinking, but also the subtle shift in how she engaged with the material. There was a thoughtfulness that hadn't been present before, a willingness to consider implications beyond profit. Afterward, as the board members filed out, Alexandra approached Clint. "I still don't understand why he chose you." "I think he saw someone who wasn't impressed by the things he'd spent his life chasing," Clint replied. "Someone who measured value differently." "And how do you measure it?" Clint considered the question. "By whether you can look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day. That's a luxury most people can't afford." "It's not a luxury, it's a necessity." Richard learned that too late. Alexandra studied him, her calculations softening into something more reflective. "You've accomplished what he wanted. The company will change course. The foundation will grow. What will you do now?" "Go home," Clint said simply. "My job here is done." "Is it that easy to walk away?" "It's never easy to walk away," he replied, "but knowing when to do it might be the most important skill there is." 1 week later, Clint stood in Richard's penthouse one final time, the space now cleared of personal items. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the city in golden light that somehow made even the most artificial structures seem momentarily authentic. Maria joined him by the window. "The transition plan is proceeding. Alexandra is different, more thoughtful. The board is following her lead." "Good." The Foundation received the first major transfer yesterday. Projects in 3 countries can now expand. She smiled slightly. "Richard would be pleased." Clint nodded, his gaze still on the city below. He spent his life building something he came to regret, then used his final months trying to transform it into something better. There's a lesson there. "What will you tell people when they ask about Richard Callaway?" Maria asked. Clint considered the question, that he learned the hardest lesson anyone can learn, which is that the measure of your life isn't what you accumulate, but what you leave behind that makes the world better. Clint turned from the window, and that it's never too late to change course even if you can't complete the journey yourself. Maria smiled. "You still haven't explained why that brief interaction on a flight affected him so deeply." "Some conversations hit harder than others," Clint replied with a small shrug. "The right words at the right time can change a life's direction." As he left the penthouse for the final time, Clint thought about Richard Callaway, a man he'd barely known yet had come to understand intimately. through the choices of his final months. They'd shared only a brief encounter, yet it had altered both their paths. In the elevator descending to the lobby, Clint reflected on the power of small moments, of quiet words spoken with conviction, of standing firm in one's values even when surrounded by those who measure worth differently. Sometimes the most profound influence comes not from grand gestures, but from simple authenticity in a world built on appearance. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm, unchanged, yet somehow different from when he'd arrived. Or perhaps what had changed was his perspective on it, seeing beyond the gleaming surfaces to the complex human stories playing out behind each window, each carefully constructed facade. Clint hailed a taxi to take him to the airport, ready to return to his own life, yet carrying with him the reminder that sometimes our briefest encounters leave the deepest imprints, not just on others, but on ourselves.